Somewhere along the misty banks of Louisiana's Bayou Teche, there once stood a plantation whose records vanished under mysterious circumstances in 1859. Old court filings from New Orleans mention a murder trial that was abruptly halted, with every transcript sealed under court order. Parish registries, however, tell a darker story. 71 graves on one property, all filled within the same week. Yet every official death certificate claimed natural causes. For more than 150 years, a single name has drifted through the whispers of Louisiana's sugarcane fields, a name tied to both horrific cruelty and unimaginable revenge. Tonight, we uncover what truly happened on the Devo plantation and why its secrets were buried deeper than any grave could reach. Before we dive into the story of Patience Devo and the young girl who brought his empire to ruin, I want to hear from you. Tap that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Are you brave enough to learn what comes next? Let's find out together. Our story doesn't begin with bloodshed. It begins with a bill of sale. St. Landry Parish spread across Louisiana's lush lowlands like a patchwork of wealth and misery. By 1853, it had become one of the South's most profitable sugar-producing regions. Plantations lined the Bayou Teche, their owners earning fortunes that rivaled the European elite. The town of Opelousas served as a parish seat, a bustling community of about 3,000 people. Planters, merchants, overseers, and enslaved men and women who made that prosperity possible. Among those planters stood Patience Devo, not famous for his fortune, though it was vast, but for his unsettling reputation. A third-generation landowner whose ancestors came from France in the 1760s, Patience, named after a Puritan forebear on his mother's side, inherited Belle Ombre Plantation at 28 after his father died of yellow fever. Now, at 42, he managed a 300-acre sugar estate with what neighbors politely called exacting standards. The Devo home towered 3 stories above the muddy Louisiana soil, its white columns gleaming under the heavy sun. 73 enslaved people worked its grounds. In the cane fields, the mill, the house, and the endless outbuildings that kept the operation running. The plantation was prosperous, producing nearly 200 hogsheads of sugar each year, enough to keep Devo among the wealthiest men in the parish. Yet Belle Ombre concealed a secret so dark that even the cruelest of Devo's peers would have turned away. Devo himself was a striking man, tall, lean, and sharp-featured, with the air of old-world nobility. He dressed in dark suits despite Louisiana's suffocating heat, kept a neatly trimmed French beard, and quoted scripture and classical philosophy with ease. Having studied in New Orleans for 2 years, he was as educated as he was disciplined. Every Sunday, he could be found at St. Landry Catholic Church, sitting in the Devo family pew purchased by his grandfather back in 1791. His wife, Claudette, had died 7 years earlier during childbirth, taking their infant son with her. Since then, Devo lived alone in the great house, attended by a rotation of servants who, neighbors quietly noted, rarely lasted more than a few months before being reassigned to field labor or sold away altogether. In the spring of 1853, Belle Ombre saw new arrivals. That March, a trader named Rufus Gaines arrived from Mobile with a car full of 22 enslaved people, smuggled to the still-thriving illegal interstate trade. Among them was a girl, perhaps 14 years old, though no one knew for certain. On the manifest, she was recorded simply as Negro Girl, Field Hand, Sound Stock. She had been born somewhere in Virginia and torn from her mother at age 7 when the state she belonged to was sold off for debt. Since then, she had passed from one owner to another, moving farther south with each sale, each transaction stripping away another piece of her identity. By the time she reached Louisiana, she had learned silence, eyes down, voice quiet, thoughts hidden behind obedience. Devo bought her for $800, an unusually high price that drew murmurs from the other planters. Field hands rarely fetched more than $500 or $600. But Devo had particular expectations, and this girl fit them exactly. Young, strong enough for labor, small in frame, and alone, with no ties to anyone nearby. The bill of sale named her Claraara, though she would later insist that wasn't her real name, just another false one forced on her by strangers. What followed would change her and Belle Ombre forever. Claraara's first month at the plantation followed the familiar rhythm of servitude. She was placed in the main house, working in the kitchen under the supervision of Aunt Rachel, an older woman who had served the Devo family for 30 years. The work was relentless, rising before dawn to cook, tending the fires, cleaning, washing, and carrying out countless chores that kept the estate running smoothly. But Claraara soon sensed that something in Belle Ombre was wrong. The house servants moved with quiet fear, their eyes darting toward Devo whenever he entered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence at his approach, and servants disappeared, replaced without explanation by new faces who, within weeks, bore the same haunted look. Aunt Rachel tried to warn her, using the careful, coded language enslaved people used when truth itself was dangerous. Master Devo got particular ways, she whispered one evening as they scrubbed pots in the kitchen house. You mind yourself, child. Keep your head low. Do your work. Don't give him reason to notice you special. But it was already too late. On a humid April night, Devo summoned Claraara to his study. The room reeked of tobacco and aged leather, its walls glowing with a flicker of oil lamps. Devo sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his expression cold and unreadable. You can read, can't you? He asked. It was a dangerous question, one that could mean life or death. Teaching enslaved people to read was forbidden in Louisiana, a crime punished by whipping, or sometimes far worse. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the floor. No, sir, she whispered. Don't lie to me. His tone was calm, almost casual. I saw you looking at the newspaper in the dining room. Your eyes were following the words. The silence between them grew thick, heavy with danger. I asked you a question, Devo continued. Can you read? Clara's thoughts raced, weighing possible answers, searching for the one that might save her. But something in his voice told her he already knew. This was no simple question. It was a trap with no safe escape. Some, sir, she finally admitted, her voice barely more than a breath. My first master's daughter. She taught me a little before. Before you were sold away, Devo finished for her. He leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting indeed. What Clara couldn't have known was that Patience Devo had been looking for someone exactly like her. Someone literate, isolated, and easily controlled. Someone he could shape to his will. Someone who wouldn't be missed. Over the following weeks, Clara's assignments changed. She was moved from general house duties to cleaning Devo's private quarters, organizing his papers, and helping with correspondence. The work seemed easier at first, quieter, cleaner, but its hidden cost revealed itself little by little through small degradations that accumulated like dust. Devo began calling her to his study every evening, supposedly to assist with his writing. But his requests became stranger. He would dictate Bible verses, ordering her to copy them over and over, scrutinizing each stroke of her pen. When she made mistakes, he'd punish her. Long hours standing perfectly still, missed meals, or subtle physical torments that left no visible marks. He bent her fingers backward until she gasped. He pressed his thumbs into the soft space behind her ears until tears welled in her eyes. His hand would tighten around her arm, firm enough to bruise the bone, but never enough to tear the skin. You must be corrected, he would say in that same calm, almost gentle voice. These are lessons in obedience, in proper submission to authority. Do you understand? The other servants understood too well. They had seen this before. They said nothing. They knew how it always ended. By June, Clara's situation had descended into something beyond anything she had endured before. Devo's so-called lesson had turned into calculated torture, methodical, deliberate, almost scientific. He seemed to treat it as an experiment in endurance, testing the limits of pain and control. Clara discovered that he kept detailed journals, thick volumes written in his precise hand. She glimpsed them once, open on his desk. The pages were filled with notes, observations on pain thresholds, methods of punishment, the psychology of breaking the will without destroying the body. With growing horror, she realized she was not the first. The journals listed previous subjects, numbered but never named, each with cold, clinical comments about their progress. Subject 7 lasted 3 months before being reassigned. Subject 9 showed initial promise, but ultimately failed. Subject 12 required disposal after an incident deemed regrettable but necessary. Claraara was Subject 13. The summer of 1853, settled over St. Landry Parish like a suffocating shroud. In the fields, enslaved workers move among the tall cane, their songs drifting faintly through the morning haze. Outwardly, life at Belle Ombre went on as usual. The tolling of work bells, the endless rhythm of cultivation, the weekly visits from neighboring planters who saw only what Devo wanted them to see. Inside the mansion, though, Claraara was vanishing, not physically, but piece by piece. Devo was dismantling her from within, cutting away parts of her spirit with the precision of a surgeon. He knew that true control required more than pain. It demanded isolation, confusion, and the slow erasure of identity. He alternated punishments to prevent her from adapting. He mixed kindness with cruelty, rewarding obedience one moment, then shattering it the next. He deprived her of sleep, blurred the line between night and day, kept her disoriented until she could no longer trust her own senses. Some nights, he forced her to read aloud from his favorite passages. Old Testament verses about masters and servants, punishment and obedience, the divine right of hierarchy. Other nights, she was made to stand silently for hours while he worked, punished for the slightest movement. He starved her, then offered food, only to mock her while she ate. He gave her impossible tasks, then punished her failures as proof of her weakness. Through it all, his public mask remained immaculate. On Sundays, he attended church, his deep baritone voice carrying hymns through the chapel. He hosted dinner parties, charming his guests with polite conversation about sugar prices and politics. To the outside world, he was a refined man, reserved since his wife's death, perhaps, but respectable. The enslaved people of Belle Ombre knew better. They always did. But what could they do? To speak up meant certain death, or worse, to be sold downriver to the brutal sugar plantations where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. So they kept their heads down, whispered prayers, and tried to ignore the faint, terrible sounds that sometimes echoed from the big house after midnight. Once, Aunt Rachel tried to intervene. She went to the overseer, Dalton, a hard, expressionless man who managed a field crews, and gently suggested that Claraara was being worked too hard, that maybe she should be reassigned. Dalton listened without emotion, then went straight to Devo. 3 days later, Aunt Rachel was taken to the punishment shed, a small, windowless structure behind the sugar mill where corrections were made. When she emerged, her back was a map of new scars. The scars on Aunt Rachel's back were more than physical. They marked a new understanding of the dangers that lived inside Belle Ombre's walls. She never spoke of Claraara again, yet small signs of compassion still appeared. Sometimes Claraara would find a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, or a small cup of water, place where she would see it. Tiny act of defiance that carried enormous risk. As summer turned toward fall, something inside Claraara began to change, not in her body, but deep within her spirit. The fire of suffering had hardened her, transforming pain into something colder, sharper, more deliberate. The mask of obedience stayed firmly in place, but behind it, something else was taking shape. It wasn't hope. Devo had extinguished that long ago. It was calculation. She began to study Devo the way he studied her. She learned his habits, his moods, his weaknesses. She noticed which evenings he drank heavily from the crystal decanter in his study, how the liquor dulled his sharpness and made him careless. She saw that he wore the key to his private rooms on a chain around his neck, but always removed it before he slept. She memorized the house as though she were drawing a map in her mind. How many steps between rooms? Where the floorboards creaked, which doors groaned on their hinges. Bit by bit, she began to piece together the true scope of what Devo had done. Through quiet observation and snatches of overheard conversation, she realized she was far from his first victim. Over the past 10 years, at least a dozen enslaved people, always young, always alone, always purchased from distant traders, had passed through Belle Ombre and vanished. Some had been sold away, broken in body and mind. Others had died, their deaths explained as fever, accidents, or misfortune. One, the girl who came just 4 months before Claraara, had been found drowned in the bayou. The death had been ruled a suicide, though no one who knew Devo believed it. The truth Claraara was uncovering would have horrified even the most hardened planners of St. Landry Parish. If you're finding this story as unsettling as it is fascinating, hit that like button and tell me what you think in the comments below. What would you have done in Claraara's place? Let's discover together what came next. What Claraara didn't yet know was that Devo had already decided her fate. His journal entries had begun to describe her as a declining asset, a liability that needed to be removed. He had even contacted the trader Rufus Gaines, asking about buyers in the Deep South, places where no questions were asked and no records kept. Claraara had less than 2 weeks before she would be sold or disposed of. October arrived with deceptive gentleness. The oppressive heat gave way to cooler air, and the fields shimmered with sugarcane ready for harvest. Belle Ombre prepared for the grinding season, the most grueling and profitable stretch of the year, when cane cutting and processing consumed every waking hour. Devo's mood shifted in ways Claraara recognized all too well. He had grown almost cheerful, even humming softly while working at his desk. His torments became irregular, distracted, as though his mind had already moved on to something else. She soon learned why. One afternoon, hidden just beyond the doorway, she overheard him speaking with his overseer. "Gaines will be here on the 20th, Devo said. "Make sure the girl is cleaned up and presentable. He's found a buyer down in the sugar parishes south of New Orleans. They're not particular about her condition, but she needs to be delivered intact." The overseer's reply was too quiet to catch, but Devo's answer was clear. "Don't worry about the details. Just have her ready for transport. After that, she's someone else's problem." Claraara's heart pounded as she listened. October 20th, 12 days away. 12 days until she would be sold into what everyone whispered was the cruelest labor in the South. The vast sugar plantations where the enslaved were worked to death, replaced as easily as broken tools. Their life expectancy rarely exceeded 3 to 5 years. She knew she would never live that long. The decision that followed wasn't a moment of impulse. It was a slow, inevitable conclusion, like water finding its course downhill. Escape was impossible. The patrols were too vigilant, the swamps too treacherous. The law saw her not as human, but as property. No one would come for her. No one could, but she could act on her own. That night, Claraara took stock of what she had. It wasn't much: her knowledge of the house, her ability to read and write, her understanding of Devo's routines. Yet she also possessed something unexpected, something he had unknowingly given her, an intimate understanding of anatomy and pain, learned from watching, enduring, and reading his clinical notes. She began to plan with the same cold precision he had once used to destroy her. The tools she needed were everywhere: sharp blades in the sugar mill, knives in the kitchen, saws and axes in the workshop. But she knew her window of opportunity would be measured in minutes, maybe seconds. She needed something small, easy to carry, and deadly enough to end what he had started. She found it in his study. On his desk lay a letter opener, a slender foot-long blade of Sheffield steel, sharp enough to slice parchment, strong enough to pierce leather. To Devo, it was a harmless desk accessory. To Claraara, it was salvation. As she studied his nightly routine, she discovered one final detail that sealed her plan. Every Wednesday, Devo drank heavily, emptying nearly a full bottle of bourbon while reviewing plantation ledgers. The liquor dulled his senses, made his movements slow, his judgment blurred. That was when he would be at his weakest, and she would be ready. Wednesday, October 14th, 6 days before she was meant to be sold. will be her only opportunity. The days leading up to it dragged with agonizing slowness. Clara moved through her routine with mechanical precision, her mind working on two levels at once, performing her daily duties while endlessly reviewing her plan, searching for weak points, weighing the odds, preparing for every possible outcome. Fear never left her. It sat in her stomach like a living thing, making it hard to eat, harder still to sleep. Yet beneath that fear burned something colder, sharper. Not hatred. Hatred was too consuming, too hot. This was different, a steady, icy resolve, a quiet acceptance of whatever price must be paid. All around her, the plantation pulsed with familiar rhythm, unaware of the storm quietly forming inside one girl's heart. In the fields, the cane stood tall, whispering in the October breeze. At the mill, the overseer Dalton oversaw repairs to the great grinding machines, readying them for the sleepless harvest weeks ahead. In the quarters, enslaved families gathered after dark, sharing food and stories, building small pockets of humanity in a world built to erase it. Clara watched all of it with strange attachment, as if she were already gone, already a ghost drifting between two worlds. She noticed details she had never seen before. The morning sunlight glinting on spiderwebs strung between porch columns, the sound of Aunt Rachel's soft humming as she worked in the kitchen, the scent of wood smoke drifting through the evening air. These small things suddenly seemed sacred, as though her mind were collecting them for a time when she would no longer be here to see them. On Monday, October 12th, a traveling preacher arrived at Bel Ombre, a thin man named Reverend Caldwell, one of those circuit ministers who moved from plantation to plantation, preaching to the enslaved under the watchful eyes of their masters. That evening, Devo allowed his workers to attend the outdoor service. Clara went because not going would raise suspicion. She stood near the back of the crowd. About 80 people gathered under the fading light as Reverend Caldwell preached about deliverance. His words came from Exodus, the story of Moses leading his people out of bondage, the plagues that struck their oppressors, the parting of the Red Sea. "The Lord sees your suffering," he cried, his voice ringing through the dusk. "He hears your cries, and in his time, in his way, he will deliver you. You must keep faith. Justice delayed is never justice denied." The words rolled over Clara like water over stone. She had heard them all before. She had clung to such promises through her darkest nights, prayed for deliverance until her knees bled. But deliverance never came. Justice never arrived. If God existed, he seemed uninterested in the cries of the enslaved in Louisiana. So she stopped waiting for divine mercy. She would create her own deliverance and her own justice, even if the cost was her life. When the service ended and people began drifting back to their cabins, Aunt Rachel approached her. The older woman's face was lined and weary, her hands rough from decades of labor, but her eyes were sharp. "Child," she said softly, positioning herself so their talk looked casual, "whatever you're planning, don't do it." Clara felt her chest tighten. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Rachel's voice was calm but firm. "I've seen that look before. There was a boy, Samuel, about 10 years back. Had that same look in his eyes, like someone who decided dying was better than living. You know what happened to him?" Clara shook her head. "They caught him before he could do whatever he'd planned. Beat him so bad he couldn't walk for a month. Then sold him off to the cotton fields in Mississippi. Heard he died within a year, worked to death under the sun." She paused, letting the story sink in. "Whatever that man's done to you, child, it ain't worth throwing your life away." "My life's already thrown away," Clara said, her voice steady now. "He's selling me on the 20th, to the sugar parishes south of New Orleans. You know what that means." Rachel's expression faltered, real fear crossing her worn features. "Oh, child, no, not there." "So tell me, Aunt Rachel," Clara said quietly, "what's the difference between dying slow and dying fast?" "At least one way I get to choose." "At least one way. I take something with me." The older woman studied her for a long, painful moment. Then she nodded slowly. I can't stop you, but if you're going to do what I think you're going to do, make sure you finish it. Don't leave him alive to tell the tale. Don't give him the chance to hurt anyone else. You understand? I understand. Rachel reached out and briefly squeezed Clara's hand. A tiny gesture that could have gone unnoticed by anyone watching. May the Lord have mercy on your soul, child, she whispered, and may he have none on his. Then she slipped away into the dark between the cabins, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and her terrible resolve. Tuesday, October 13th, dawned gray and cool, heavy clouds threatening rain that never came. Clara woke before sunrise and went through a routine as always, tending fires, preparing breakfast, carrying trays to the house, washing, cleaning, the endless cycle of invisible labor. But today felt different. Today, every action carried new weight now. Every small moment could be her last taste of ordinary life. She began to notice sensations she had always ignored. The coarse feel of linen beneath her fingertips as she folded the laundry, the way sunlight broke through clouds to warm her skin, the simple taste of cornbread at noon. That afternoon, Devo summoned her to his study, a summons she knew, with grim certainty, would be for a final session before she was sent away. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, past a long hallway lined with portraits of his ancestors, staring down with cold, painted eyes, and knocked softly on the heavy door. Enter, came his voice. The room looked as it always did, immaculate, refined, deceptively civilized. Books filled the walls, their leather spines gleaming in the amber light that filtered to the tall windows. His large desk dominated the space, covered in orderly stacks of papers, ledgers, and correspondence. The crystal decanter of bourbon sat beside two glasses, waiting. Oil lamps stood unlit, ready for evening. Devo sat behind the desk, dressed to perfection, dark suit, crisp white shirt. When Clara entered, he looked up, his expression mild, almost kind. "Ah, Clara," he said pleasantly. "Come in." Close the door. "Sit." He gestured toward the straight-back chair across from him, the same one where she had spent countless hours enduring his lessons. She sat, eyes lowered, posture submissive, exactly as he demanded. "I want to talk to you about your future," he began, folding his hand together, a gesture she knew well. "Mr. Gaines will be arriving in a few days to finalize your transfer to new ownership. I thought you might have questions about what awaits you." That was new. He had never before explained his decisions. The false courtesy felt surreal. "I have no questions, sir," she said quietly. "No curiosity?" His tone was almost friendly. "You don't wish to know where you're going or what kind of work you'll do." Clara recognized this tactic. The oscillation between cruelty and false kindness meant to disorient. "No, sir." He studied her face for a long moment, his gaze sharp beneath the mild expression. "You're lying," he said at last. "You already know where you're headed. The sugar parishes, the places where they grind workers down like cane stalks, where 5 years is a long life. You're terrified, aren't you?" Clara said nothing. "It's all right to feel fear," Devo went on. "Fear is reasonable. Fear keeps one alive. But the greatest danger," he added, leaning forward slightly, "is not what lies ahead, it's the temptation to avoid it. You understand me, Clara?" It was a warning, gentle in tone, and all the more chilling because of it. "Yes, sir," she answered. "Good." He leaned back, seemingly satisfied. "You've been a challenging subject. Not as docile as some, but far more resilient. I'll miss our evenings together, in a way. But every experiment must end eventually. I'm eager to begin new work, with fresh material." He poured himself a drink, letting the bourbon catch the light as he swirled it in his glass. Then, with unsettling calm, he asked, "Tell me, Clara, do you hate me?" It was a trap. Either answer could provoke punishment. Yet she heard herself answer with startling honesty. "No, sir." And it was true. Hatred required some form of connection, a shared humanity. What she felt toward him was colder, more absolute. Not emotion, but conviction. He did not deserve to exist. Devo smiled, pleased by what he thought was submission. Good, he said softly. Hatred clouds a mind. Obedience requires clarity and purity of purpose. You're still learning, even now. He took another sip, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. I've kept detailed records of our time together, he continued. Observations, measurements, the results of various techniques. Fascinating work. The human ability to endure, to adapt, even under the harshest conditions. It's extraordinary. You contributed to knowledge that may prove useful one day. Clara listened, detached, as though hearing confession of a man already dead. He was describing her agony as science, her pain as data, her existence reduced to an experiment. But she felt no anger, no despair, only the icy certainty of what would happen tomorrow night. You may go, Devo said finally, waving her away. Get some rest. Mr. Dalton will want you looking presentable when Mr. Gaines arrives. Clara rose, curtsied as he required, and walked out, down the hall, down the stairs, through the house. Every step measured, controlled, the movement of a mechanism wound tight, counting down to release. Aunt Rachel was in the kitchen, cutting vegetables for supper. She looked up, her eyes full of silent questions. Clara gave a single nod, almost imperceptible, but enough. Rachel's lips moved in a whisper, a prayer perhaps, before she looked back to her work. Her knife moved steadily through the carrots, and Clara understood. There would be no more words between them. Some things existed beyond speech, beyond comfort, beyond hope. That night, Clara lay on her pallet in the small room off the kitchen, staring up at the dark ceiling. Around her, the house eased into its familiar nighttime rhythm. Faint sounds drifted through the walls, the overseer's distant footsteps, muffled voices from the quarters beyond the yard, the creak of old timber and the whisper of wind against glass. She knew she should rest. She would need every ounce of strength for what awaited her, but sleep refused to come. Her mind raced through endless scenarios, each one ending in the same place. She thought of her mother, little more than a shadow now, a lullaby in the dark. Warm arms that once held her, a face blurred by time into longing. Then of herself at 7 years old, standing on an auction block of Virginia, forcing back tears as strange men inspected her like livestock, arguing over a price as if she couldn't hear them. Since then, each new master had taken something else, memory, name, dignity, until she no longer recognized who she once was. Even her name now was not her own, just another brand imposed by others. She wasn't seen as a person, not by the laws that bound her, nor by the world that thrived on her bondage. But tomorrow night, that would change. She would act. She would choose. She would refuse to meet her end in silence. It wasn't much, maybe not enough, but it was hers. The hours crawled by until the gray light of dawn finally seeped through the small window. The plantation bell told the start of another day, Wednesday, October 14th. Her final day as Clara, her final day as anything at all. She rose and dressed, moving through her chores on instinct alone, preparing breakfast, cleaning, fetching water, sweeping, washing, her hand performing what her mind had already abandoned. Each motion was just a countdown, every task another step toward nightfall. At midday, she forced down a meal of beans and cornbread, ignoring the knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She needed her strength. There could be no weakness now. Later that afternoon, she was alone in Devo's study. He had gone to the sugar mill with the overseer, leaving the room empty, quiet, waiting. The letter opener lay across his desk among papers and ledgers, its polished steel catching the light. She had dusted around it countless times, never giving it thought. But now she saw it differently, its foot-long blade, the solid weight of it, the keen edge meant to glide through paper or flesh. She picked it up, testing its heft. It was heavier than she expected. Real, final, not just an idea, but a weapon, the bridge between thought and deed. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she made her choice. She couldn't wait until night to take it. If he noticed its absence, everything would be over before it began. Yet carrying it through the afternoon carried its own danger. If anyone searched her, she acted quickly, wrapping the blade in a cleaning cloth. She hid it deep inside her dress pocket, arranging the fabric so the shape wouldn't show. Its weight tugged at the cloth, a constant reminder of what she was preparing to do. She finished cleaning, left the study, and moved through the rest of the day with the hidden steel press against her leg. Silent, heavy, waiting. Evening descended in fire and gold, the sky bleeding color as if mocking her resolve. Clara helped with supper, served Devo his meal, cleared the table, performed every motion as though nothing had changed, though everything had. At 8 o'clock, as always, Devo retired to his study. Through the closed door, she heard the familiar sounds, the clink of bourbon poured into glass, the squeak of his chair, the rustle of paper. She waited in the hallway, her back to the wall, one hand wrapped tightly around the hidden handle. Her heartbeat felt deafening, a drum of fear and purpose. No one saw her. No one spoke. The house murmured with the soft, ordinary sounds of night. Minutes warped and stretched until, at 9 precisely, his voice called from the other side of the door. "Clara, attend me." This was it, the threshold she could never uncross. Once she stepped through, everything would follow like falling dominoes. She inhaled deeply, feeling the cold weight of steel one last time, then opened the door and stepped inside. The room glowed with the flicker of oil lamps, shadows crawling across walls lined with books. Devo sat behind his broad mahogany desk, face flushed from drink, the half-empty bourbon bottle gleaming beside him. He had already drunk more than usual, just as she'd hoped. His movements, when his hand motioned for her to shut the door, though the gesture was slower than usual, slightly uncertain. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, the look of a man who had drunk too much and believed himself invincible. Tonight, he wasn't. His guard was down, his reflexes dulled, his judgment fogged by liquor. "Come here," he commanded, pointing to the spot beside his desk, the same place she had been forced to stand countless times before. Clara stepped forward, her right hand buried in her pocket, fingers locked tightly around the hidden handle. The world seemed to stretch and narrow at once. Every heartbeat thundered in her ears. She saw the dust spinning to the lamplight, the shimmer of bourbon in the decanter, the tidy stacks of ledgers that turned human lives into numbers and margins of profit. She smelled the mix of bourbon and tobacco, leather and ink, the scented world of power and ownership. Devo's fingers tapped the desk absently. "I've been reviewing your progress," he said, his words slurred but proud. "Remarkable resilience, extraordinary endurance. It's almost a shame our project must end." He reached for his glass, lifting it to his lips. As his head tilted back, the skin of his throat caught the light. Pale, unguarded, vulnerable. Clara moved. In one swift motion, she tore the letter opener from her pocket and thrust it toward him with every ounce of strength in her body. But fear and adrenaline blurred her precision. The blade missed its mark, burying itself deep in his shoulder instead of his neck. He let out a strangled roar, staggering up with such violence that his chair crashed backward into the bookshelf. His hand clawed at the handle jutting from his shoulder, eyes wide with rage and disbelief. "You!" he choked, his voice raw. "You dare!" But Clara didn't let him finish. 6 months of degradation, pain, and humiliation surged through her at once. She hurled herself at him, fists striking wherever they could land. Her light frame slammed into his, sending both crashing into the shelf behind. Books rained down, heavy, thudding volumes that burst open as they fell. He was stronger, she knew he would be, but he was also wounded, half-drunk, bleeding heavily. His movements were sluggish, clumsy, slowed by pain and shock. They fought in brutal silence, both knowing a scream would bring others, would end everything. The only sounds were their gasps for air, the crash of furniture, the scrape of boots on the wooden floor. Then his hands closed around her throat. His fingers dug in, crushing her windpipe, cutting off her breath. Blackness began to swim at the edges of her vision. Her lungs burned. So this is it, she thought. After all of it, he'll still win. Her hand groped blindly and found the knife, still lodged in his shoulder. She seized the handle, slick with blood, and tore it free with a wet, tearing sound that seemed to echo through her bones. Then she drove it into him. Again, and again, and again. Each strike was fueled by months of pain, by every memory of cruelty, by the thought of all who had come before her. She stabbed wherever she could reach, his chest, his ribs, his arms as he tried to defend himself, until the strength drained from his limbs and his grip around her neck loosened. He stumbled backward, crashing into the desk. His head struck the corner with a heavy, sickening sound that made her stomach twist. Then he fell. He lay sprawled on the floor, blood spreading beneath him, the lamplight glinting off its dark sheen like oil. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were wide now, filled not with power but something new, real fear. Clara stood over him, chest heaving, the letter opener dripping crimson in her hand. This was the turning point. She could run, vanish into the swamp, into darkness, though she knew what awaited an escaped woman in Louisiana. Capture, death, or she could finish it. She looked down at him, the man who had bought and broken lives, who had recorded every cruelty as if it were science, who had destroyed her humanity piece by piece. The man who had done the same to so many before her, and would, if he lived through that night. He would surely do it again to whoever came after her. But something else had awoken in Clara, something beyond mere survival or revenge. A cold, meticulous fury had taken hold, one that demanded completion. Every ounce of pain repaid, a particular, terrible justice carried out to its end. She looked around the study at the ordinary objects that now promised extraordinary uses. The letter opener, still clenched in her hand, glinted dark with blood. A heavy brass candlestick set on the desk. A fire poker leaned against the hearth. Small tools and implements lay in drawers and on shelves. Each could be turned into an instrument of purpose. Then she stared at Devo himself, still alive, still breathing, still coherent enough to understand. When his eyes met hers, she saw something she had never seen in him. Pure, helpless fear. "You studied pain," she said, her voice oddly distant even her own ears. "You recorded it like a scientist. You wrote about thresholds and tolerances, about breaking points. Now you're going to learn what you taught me." What followed would stagger even those who thought they had seen everything that plantation life could produce. It would become a story that echoed for generations and recast Clara from prey into something else, a figure that embodied both the deepest cruelty and the ultimate endurance of the human spirit. In that moment, she made a choice, a decision part calculated, part driven by a fury that edged into reason. She would not merely kill Patience Devo. She would take him apart, reduce him to the raw components he himself had used to dehumanize others. She would treat him as he had treated those he owned, as material for study, to be cataloged and discarded. She worked with methodical intent. The letter opener remained her constant tool. The brass candlestick served as a hammer. The fire poker functioned as a lever. Everyday objects from Devo's desk and drawers, once used for trivial domestic tasks, were repurposed for a darker, relentless purpose. All the while, she moved carefully. She would not allow him to die too quickly. Mercy was not the point. She muffled his mouth with cloth to reduce noise, conscious that the people in the quarters must not be implicated. This was her act alone. Her months of torment had taught her much about the human body. She had learned, through suffering and through the notes he kept, how pain mapped onto flesh, what caused immediate death, and what left a wound that lingered. She applied that knowledge with cold, clinical precision. Hours passed. The oil lamps burned low, and she refilled them from the reserve Devo kept in the cabinet. A small, mundane motion amid the surreal work she was doing. Night deepened outside, and the house settled into silence broken only by crickets and the occasional creak of timber. Throughout it all, Clara worked with the patient focus of someone completing an unavoidable task, dismantling the man who had tried to dismantle her, step by step, with the same detached attention he had once used on others. She counted as she worked, a compelled mimicry of his obsession with records. Each act, each reduction, each element removed was marked in her mind and added to an invisible tally that climbed with the hours. 71, she would later say. Whether that number was literal or symbolic, no one could ever fully determine. Maybe it stood for every person Devo had owned. Maybe for the 71 days of particular torment she had kept in her head. Maybe it was simply the number that felt complete to her in that moment. Whatever its origin, it felt like the right summation of what she had been forced to endure. When she finally finished, when there remained no part of patience Devo that could still be called a whole man, she arranged the remnants across the study floor with terrible care. Dawn's first pale light began to wash through the windows, the color of ash, of endings. Clara stood in the doorway, soaked in blood from head to hem, the letter opener hanging limply in her hand, and surveyed what she had done. There was no triumph, no sense of relief. Feeling itself felt absent, as though the part of her that had once reacted had been cut away along with everything Devo had stolen. In becoming what it tried to make of her, an efficient instrument of purpose, she had, paradoxically, reclaimed that purpose for herself. She left the study, moved through the big house, down the front steps, and into the dim morning light. The study door stood open behind her, exposing shapes and shadows that would haunt anyone who later saw them. She walked down the gravel drive, leaving dark prints on the pale stones where her bare feet met the ground. Workers in the fields were beginning to gather for the day. Their voices fell silent as they saw her approach. Shock and fear showed on their faces, and something else, too, that might have been recognition or understanding or a terrible, fragile hope. She kept walking until she reached the main road, and there she simply stopped. The letter opener hung from her fingers. Her expression was blank, her eyes fixed on some distant point only she could see. She did not try to hide. She did not run. She had done what she set out to do, and now she would accept whatever followed. 3 hours later, patrol found her standing in the same spot, the knife still in her hand, her dress stiff with dry blood, her face emptied of everything but exhaustion. When the sheriff asked what happened, she answered without emotion. "I killed Patience Devo," she said. "He needed killing. I regret nothing except that I could only kill him once." The discovery of Patience Devo's remains unleashed chaos across St. Landry Parish. At dawn, when the overseer Dalton opened the study door to review the day's labor assignments and found the room oddly silent, what he saw froze him. His scream summoned the other house servants. Aunt Rachel was first to arrive. She peered inside for a heartbeat, then pushed the others away, desperate to spare them a fuller view. But the sight had already been glimpsed. Word raced through the quarters on terrified breaths and stunned faces. By mid-morning, the sheriff was there, Budrow, accompanied by a coroner named Harding and half a dozen armed deputies. They closed the room and began the grim work of cataloging what they found. Harding, a man who had performed autopsies on yellow fever victims and dissected bodies after the Mexican War, emerged pale and shaken. He refused to elaborate beyond the bare facts required for his report. "I've seen men torn by cannon fire," he told the sheriff in a voice that trembled. "I've opened drowned bodies pulled from rivers. I've dissected cadavers in anatomy school. In 20 years of practice, I have never seen anything like what's in that room. It's not human." He could not finish the sentence. Sheriff Budrow, who had held his post for 15 years, went in himself. He did not stay long, perhaps 5 minutes, and when he walked back out, his face had drained of color. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his pipe, and he smoked 3 bowls of tobacco in quick succession before issuing orders. "No one speaks of what's in that room," he told his deputies, voice low and urgent. "Not your families, not your friends, not anyone. Whatever we saw in their stays at Bel Amber, Understood. The deputies nodded, as unnerved as their leader. By noon, the news of Devo's death had spread across the parish, but official detail remained tightly controlled. After conferring with the parish judge and several prominent planners, Sheriff Budrow released a simple statement. Patience Devo had been murdered by an enslaved woman from his household, who had been taken into custody. Everything else was left unspoken. Rumor, however, moved faster than formal announcements. In the fields and quarters, the enslaved whispered what they dared in coded phrases. In Opelousas taverns, freed men and poor whites traded increasingly lurid versions of the story. Numbers multiplied and exaggerated. Some said Devo had been cut into 50 pieces. Others claimed 100. Some swore the girl had drunk his blood. Others insisted she had eaten his heart. Truth dissolved in a swirl of rumor and counter-rumor, each telling more grotesque than the last. What was no rumor was a reaction among the enslaved at Belle Amber and beyond. Within days, an extraordinary form of resistance unfolded across St. Landry Parish. Not violent uprising, not pitched battle, but a steady, deliberate refusal to work. People gathered in the quarters and in hidden groves, simply refusing to go to the fields or obey orders. Within a week, more than 200 had assembled in concealed encampments in the woods and swamps around the plantation. They lit fires, shared food, and waited. They issued no demands and drafted no manifestos. They simply existed in collective refusal, a stance that sent a tremor of panic through the planter class. It was the closest thing to organized resistance the region had seen since the 1811 German Coast Uprising, and it terrified the white population. Patrols were doubled, then tripled. Militia companies were called up. Armed planters rode the roads between the states, searching for signs of a broader insurrection. Yet the assembled men and women remained largely peaceful. No assaults, no organized violence. They would not return to labor until Claraara, or whatever name she bore, received the justice they sought. That demand presented a legal and political problem for Louisiana's slaveholding order. Under the Black Codes, an enslaved person who murdered a master was to be executed swiftly and publicly as a warning. But this case posed complications that made the routine spectacle impossible. First was the study itself. During a careful search, authorities found Devo's journals, years of meticulous records documenting methods of systematic torture, notes about victims, clinical descriptions that read like cold, methodical science. The content was so incendiary that Judge Rossard, a 40-year veteran of the bench, ordered the documents sealed immediately. These could not be made public. Rossard told the sheriff and the parish prosecutor in a private meeting, "If this gets out, we cannot predict the consequences. The enslaved population will use it as justification for violence. Northern abolitionist papers will seize on it as propaganda. Our social order would be threatened." The prosecutor argued that the journals provided context for Clara's actions, that they explained what she had done. Rossard cut him off. "They are the ravings of disturbed mind," he said. "They will never see the light of day. Seal them, lock them away. They are not to be entered into record." And so the journals were boxed and placed in the parish courthouse vault. Documents that would remain hidden, officially at least, for the next century and a half. A second complication was the physical nature of the crime. The scene suggested sustained assault that required strength, anatomical knowledge, and endurance far beyond what observers expected from someone of Clara's size and condition. Medical men called in to inspect the study were baffled by the precision of the work, the apparent familiarity with anatomy, and the stamina necessary to complete it. How had she accomplished such a thing? The answers, when they existed, were messy and unsatisfactory. Investigators also faced the volatile reality outside courtrooms. The gathered enslaved people demanded that Claraara be treated according to their sense of justice. The planter class demanded order. The judge and sheriff feared the repercussions of revealing too much. So the official record was shaped to contain and contain again. Budrow's public statement and Brossard's seal vault were designed to close the wound rather than expose what lay beneath it. But closure is not the same as truth. For the people of St. Landry, the story continued to spread, mutate, and hardened into legend. It would be whispered in cane fields and at kitchen tables. It would be the bone-deep subject of rumors in parish taverns and the anxious topic of private conversations among men who owned slaves. Whether the lurid details were true mattered less than the fact that something had ruptured. A line had been crossed that destabilized a fragile sense of control plantation society relied on. Such work. It's not possible, one doctor insisted. A girl her size and strength simply could not have done this alone. There must have been others, multiple assailants working together. But Claraara, when questioned, maintained she had acted alone. "No one helped me," she stated flatly during her one and only interrogation. "No one knew what I was planning. This was my choice and mine alone. I will not allow others to be punished for my actions." Third, and most troubling for the parish authorities, was the continued presence of the assembled enslaved people in the forests and swamps. They showed no signs of dispersing. If anything, their numbers were growing as word spread to neighboring parishes. And while they remained peaceful, their very presence challenged authority in a way that could not be ignored. The trial itself was conducted in near total secrecy. The courtroom was closed to public. No journalists were permitted. No transcript was made of the proceedings. Claraara was represented by a court-appointed attorney named Hebert, a young lawyer who spoke perhaps 50 words on her behalf, most of them procedural formalities. The prosecution presented its case in less than an hour. Devo was dead. Claraara had confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. The law was clear. The verdict should have been death, carried out publicly as a warning. But Judge Broussard faced an impossible situation. Executing Claraara would provoke the gathered enslaved people to violence. He had no doubt of that. The parish did not have sufficient forces to control an uprising of that scale. People would die. Property would be destroyed. The entire social order of the region would be threatened. On the other hand, failing to execute her would be seen as weakness. It would suggest that enslaved people could murder their masters and escape justice, encouraging further resistance and rebellion. Broussard adjourned the trial without issuing a verdict, claiming he needed time to consider the legal complexities. In reality, he spent 3 days in frantic consultation with the governor, prominent planners, and militia commanders, trying to find a solution that satisfied law and order without triggering violence. The solution, when it came, was characteristically Southern in its mixture of pragmatism and dishonesty. On October 28, 1853, Sheriff Budrow issued a brief statement. The matter of the death of patient Devo has been resolved to the satisfaction of the court and in accordance with the laws of Louisiana. Justice has been served. All enslaved persons are ordered to return to their plantations and resume their normal duties. Any who refuse will be considered in rebellion and dealt with accordingly. No further details were provided. No verdict was announced. No execution was recorded. Claraara vanished from official records after that date. No sale appears in any parish registry. Her name simply ceases to appear in documentation. The assembled enslaved people, after several more days of tense standoff, gradually dispersed and returned to their plantations. No violence occurred. No arrests were made. Life in St. Landry Parish slowly returned to its normal rhythms, though an undercurrent of tension lingered for years. What actually happened to Claraara became the subject of endless speculation and rumor. Some claimed she had been sold to a plantation in Texas, her identity obscured to prevent her from becoming a martyr. Others insisted she had been quietly executed and buried in an unmarked grave in the woods behind Belle Ombre. A few whispered that she had been helped to escape by abolitionists, smuggled north through the Underground Railroad to freedom in Canada. There was even a persistent rumor, never confirmed but never entirely dispelled, that Judge Broussard had made a deal with powerful interests, that Claraara had been purchased by agents working for Northern abolitionists. Money had changed hands, and she had been transported out of Louisiana under cover darkness to live freely far from the scenes of her ordeal. The truth, like so much else in this case, was deliberately obscured, hidden behind layers of official silence and unofficial myth-making. What is known is this: Belle Ombre Plantation was sold at auction in December 1853, purchased by a consortium of planters who divided the property among themselves. The big house was demolished the following spring. Its materials salvaged or burned, the site left empty. Within 5 years, the Louisiana forest had begun to reclaim the land, vines, and undergrowth covering what had once been manicured grounds and cultivated fields. The 71 burial plots mentioned in parish records, discovered by workers clearing the grounds after the auction, were never adequately explained. Official documents claim they contained victims of a yellow fever outbreak, though no such epidemic was recorded in St. Landry Parish during 1853 or 1854. The plots were shallow, hastily dug, and contained no coffins or markers. Local historians who later researched the matter found no death certificates, no names, no explanation for why so many people would have been buried on the same property in the same week. Some speculated there were not graves at all, but rather holes dug by authorities searching for evidence, though evidence of what was never clarified. Others believed they were symbolic. Perhaps 71 separate sites where parts of Devo had been buried, each piece interred individually as a grim memorial to Claraara's methodical vengeance. Or perhaps they marked the number of people Devo had tortured and killed over the years, victims whose deaths had been disguised as disease, accident, or simply erased from record. The truth was never officially established, and after a few years the question ceased to be asked. In the decades that followed, the story of Claraara and patient Devo became legend, then myth, then a whispered tale told in the quarters of Louisiana plantations. Among enslaved communities, she became a folk hero, her name, or the name she had been given, since her real name was never known, invoked as a reminder that even the most powerless person possessed the capacity for resistance that cruelty could breed. The consequences of Claraara's actions rippled far beyond that night. Among the enslaved, she became a symbol of resistance, proof that the human spirit could not be entirely broken, no matter how systematic the attempt. Among the planter class, she became a cautionary tale, rarely spoken directly but always present as a reminder. Absolute power was never as absolute as it seemed, and cruelty could provoke consequences that threatened the entire system on which their wealth and comfort depended. The sealed journals remain in the parish courthouse vault, officially forgotten, occasionally rediscovered by curious clerks or historians, who were quickly worn away. Some claim to have glimpsed portions, reporting content so disturbing they refused to describe it. Others insisted the journals had long since been destroyed, the seal box containing nothing but ashes and dust. The Civil War came and went. Slavery ended through federal force rather than internal collapse. Louisiana entered the long, brutal period of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, with violence and resistance continuing in new forms under new names. Claraara's story faded from public memory, preserved only in oral traditions and in sealed documents that few knew existed and fewer still were allowed to see. Yet in certain corners of St. Landry Parish, among communities with long memories, the story persisted. Older generations told younger ones of the girl who had killed her master, who had refused to die quietly, who had transformed her suffering into something that could not be ignored. Whether she lived or died, whether she found freedom or remained in bondage until emancipation, whether she ever reclaimed her true name or remained Clara forever, these questions were never answered with certainty. What remained was the undeniable fact of what she had done. On the night of October 14th, 1853, a young woman subjected to unspeakable cruelty had refused to accept that suffering as her fate. She had acted knowing that action meant almost certain death, choosing violence not from madness, but from cold calculation. Her life was already forfeit, and therefore she had nothing left to lose. The number 71, whether literal or symbolic, became attached to her story permanently. 71 pieces of a man who had tried to break her. 71 responses to months of systematic torture. 71 reasons why silence in the face of cruelty is itself a form of violence. The sealed documents remain locked away in archives few access, and fewer are permitted to examine. The property that once was Belle Ombre has changed hands many times, subdivided and developed, its dark history erased by time and deliberate forgetting. Modern residents, if they know the name at all, associate it vaguely with something bad that happened long ago. The details lost to generations of silence. But the story persists, passed down through communities that remember, told in different versions, but always carrying the same essential truth. A girl whose name was taken, whose humanity was denied, whose suffering was treated as scientific data, had refused to accept her own annihilation. She struck back with terrible precision and paid whatever price her action required, becoming something more than a victim, more than a slave, something that resisted easy categorization or comfortable historical narratives. She became someone who acted, someone who chose, someone who refused to be erased. And in a system built entirely on denial of such agency, that alone was revolutionary. This mystery reminds us that even in the darkest moments of American history, in the depths of institutionalized cruelty and oppression, individual acts of resistance could shake the foundations of the very system that created them. The number 71 echoes through history as a reminder what happens when human beings are pushed beyond endurance, when the only choice left is between passive destruction and active resistance. What do you think of this story? Was Claraara justified in what she did? Do you believe she survived, or was this her final act? Would you have made the same choice in her position? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this dark chapter from Louisiana's hidden history, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell so you never miss another story, and share this video with someone who appreciates historical mysteries that challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths. The past is full of stories deliberately buried, stories that deserve to be told. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.